Hey guys, Brent here.
Prologue of the Forgotten Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer. The Forgotten Planet by Murray Leinster. About the characters in this book. There is something of an oddity among fiction stories, because some of its characters may be met in person if you wish. Down at the nearest weed patch or thicket, you are quite likely to see a large and unusually perfect spider web, with a zigzag silk ribbon woven into its center. Its engineer is the yellow-banded garden spider, Epeira fasciata, whose abdomen may be as big as your thumb. I do not name it to impress you, but to suggest a sort of science fiction experience. Take a bit of straw and disturb the web. Don't break the cables. Simply tap them a bit. The spider will know by the feel of things that you aren't prey and that it can't eat you. So it will set out, frightening you away. It will run nimbly to the center of the web and shake itself violently. The whole web will vibrate, so that presently the spider may be swinging through an arc inches in length, and blurred by the speed of its swing. You are supposed to be scared. When you are alarmed enough, the spider will stop. That spider, very much magnified, is in this book, with crickets and grasshoppers and divers beetles you may not know personally. But this is not an insect book, but science fiction. If the habits of the creatures in it are authentic, it is because they are much more dramatic and interesting than things one can invent. Murray Leinster. Prologue. The survey ship Tethys made the first landing on the planet, which had no name. It had an ample atmosphere and many seas, which the nearby sun warmed so lavishly that a perpetual cloud bank hid them and most of the solid ground from view. It had mountains and continents and islands and high plateaus. It had day and night and wind and rain, and its mean temperature was within the range to which human beings could readily accommodate. It was rather on the tropic side, but not unpleasant. But there was no life on it. No animals roamed its continents. No vegetation grew from its rocks. Not even bacteria struggled with its stones to turn them into soil. So there was no soil, rocks and stones and gravel, and even sand, yes, but no soil in which any vegetation could grow. No living thing, however small, swims in its oceans. So there was not even mud on the ocean bottoms. It was that disappointing vast majority of it which turned up when the galaxy was first explored. People couldn't live there because none lived there before. Its water was fresh and its oceans clean. Its air was germ-free and breathable, but it was of no use whatever for men. The only possible purpose of Earth would have been a biological laboratory for experiments involving things growing in a germ-free environment. Like that. When visitors traveled to the stars, they made the journey because it was starkly necessary to find new worlds for men to live on. Earth was overcrowded, terribly so, so men looked for new worlds to move to. They found plenty of new worlds, but presently they were searching for new worlds where life could be. It didn't matter whether the life was meek and harmless or ferocious and deadly. If life of any sort were present, but highly organized beings like men could not live where there was no other life. made sure that the world had no life upon it. Then it made routine measurements of the gravitational constant and the magnetic field and the temperature gradient. It took samples of the air and water. The rocks were familiar enough, no novelties there, but the planet was simply useless. The survey ship put its findings on a sheet 6 inches by 8 and went hastily on in search of something better. The ship did not even have reports while on the planet. There were no consequences of the Tethys visit except that card.
40.
None whatever.
I have 40 watermelons
No other
now?
ship came near the planet for 800 years. Nearly a millennium later, however, the seed ship Orana arrived. By that time, humanity had spread very widely and very far. There were colonies no less than a quarter of the way to the galaxy's rim. And Earth was no longer overcrowded. There was still emigration, but it was now a trickle, instead of the swarming flood of centuries before. Some of the first colonized worlds had immigrants now. Mankind didn't count itself together then. Men now considered that there was no excuse for such monstrous as they currently produced. Now, too, the starships were faster. 100 light years was a short journey. 1,000 was not impractical. Explorers had gone many times farther, still waiting for mankind on beyond. But still, the great majority of discovered planets did not contain life. Whole solar systems floated in space with no single living cell on any of their members. So the seed ships came into being. Theirs was not a glamorous service. They merely methodically contaminated sterile worlds with the seed ship Orana, which still had no name. It carefully infected. It circled endlessly above the clouds, dribbling out of fine dust the spores of every conceivable microorganism which could break down rock to powder and turn that dust into soil. It was also a seeding of molds and fungi and lichens, which could turn powdery primitive soil into stuff in which higher forms of life could grow. The Orana flooded the seas with life. Then it too went away. 4 centuries passed. Human ships again improved. 5 years became a short journey. Explorers reached the galaxy's very edge, unwittingly across the emptiness toward other island universes. There were colonies in the Milky Way. There were freight lines between star clusters, and commercial centers of human affairs shifted some hundreds of parsecs toward the rim. There were many worlds where the schools painstakingly taught the children what Earth was and where, and that all other worlds had been populated from it. And the schools repeated, too, the one lesson that humankind seemed genuinely to have learned, that the secret of peace is freedom, and the secret of freedom is being able to move away from people with whom you do not agree.
Where do I?
There were no crowded worlds anymore, but human beings love children, and they have them. Children grow up and need room, so more worlds had to be looked out for. They weren't urgently needed yet, but they would be. Therefore, nearly 1,000 years after the Orana, the ecology ship Ludred swam to the planet from space and landed on it. It was a gigantic ship of highly improbable purpose. First of all, it checked on the consequences of the Orana's visit. Things were highly satisfactory from a technical point of view. Now, there was soil, which swarmed with minute living things. There were fungi, which throve monstrously. The seas stank of minuscule life forms. There were even monsters developed by the strictly local conditions. There were, for example, paramecia, as big as grapes, and yeasts had increased in size until they bore flowers visible to the naked eye. The life of the planet Aborigines. All of which was descended and adapted and modified from the microorganisms ship whose hulk was long since rust and whose crew were merely names in genealogy. For considerably longer than either of the ships that had visited before. It dropped the seeds of plants, broadcast innumerable varieties which should take root and grow. It deliberately seeded the stinking soil. It put marine plants in the oceans. It put alpine plants on the high ground. And when all its stable varieties were set out, its plants were genetically unstable. For generations to come, they would throw spores, some of which should be especially suited to this planetary. Before it left, the Ludred dumped finny fish into the seas. They would live, which made the ocean almost full. There were many varieties of fish. Some would multiply swiftly while small. Others would grow and feed on the smaller varieties. And as a last activity, the Ludred would set up refrigeration units loaded with insect eggs. Some would release their contents as soon as plants had grown enough to furnish them with food. Others would allow their contents to hatch only after certain other varieties had multiplied to be their food supply. When the ecology ship left, it had done a very painstaking job. To a sort of Russell's mixture. This mixture is that blank. This is a blank. Some should survive by consuming down by preying on the former. The planet is stocked, in effect, with everything that could be hoped would live there. But only certain things could have that hope. Nothing which needed parental care had any chance of survival. The had to be those which could care from the instant they burst. Birds or mammals, trees and plants of many kinds, fish and crustaceans and tadpoles, and all kinds of insects could be planted, but nothing else. It should have been a ship from the zoological branch of the ecological service. It should have landed birds and beasts and reptiles. It should have added pelagic mammals to the sea. There should have been herbivorous animals to live on the grasses and plants which would have thriven, and carnivorous animals to live on them in turn. There should have been careful stocking of the planet with animal life, and repeated visits at intervals of a century or so to make sure that a true ecological balance had been established. And then, when the balance was fixed, men would come and destroy it for their own benefit. But there was an accident. Ships had improved again. Even small private stations journeyed tens of kilometers on holiday journeys. Personal cruisers traveled hundreds. Liners ran matter-of-factly on ship lines tens of thousands of light years long. An exploring ship was on its way to a second island universe. It did not come back. The inhabited planets were all members of the organization, limiting itself to affairs of space without attempting to interfere in service matters. The organization moved the ecological preparation service files to all four. In the moving, a card file was upset. The cards that remained were picked up and replaced, but one was missed. It was not picked up, it was left behind. So the planet which had no name was forgotten. No other ship came to prepare it for ultimate human occupancy. It circled its sun, unheeded and unthought of. Cloud banks covered it from pole to pole. There were hazy markings in some places where high plateaus penetrated its clouds, but that was all. From space, the planet was essentially featureless. Seen from afar, it was merely a round white ball, white from its cloud banks and nothing else. But on its surface, on its lowlands, it was pure nightmare. But this fact did not matter for a very long time. Ultimately, it mattered a great deal to the crew of the space liner Icarus. The Icarus was a splendid ship of its time. It bore passengers headed for one of the galaxy's spiral arms, and it cut across the normal lanes and headed through charted but unvisited parts of the galaxy toward its destination. And it had one of the very, very few accidents known to happen to spacecraft licensed to travel off normal space lanes. It suffered shipwreck in space, and its passengers and crew were forced to take to the lifeboat. The lifeboat's range was limited. They landed on the planet that the Tempest had first examined, that the Orana and the Ludred had seeded, and of which there was no longer any record in the card files of the Ecological Service. Their fuel was exhausted. They could not leave. They could not signal for help. They had to stay there, and the planet was a place of nightmares. After a time, the few people, some few thousands, who knew that there was a space liner named Icarus, gave it up for lost. They forgot about it. Everybody forgot. Even the passengers and the crew of the ship forgot it. Not immediately, of course. For the first few generations, their descendants cherished hopes of rescue. But the planet, which had no name, the forgotten planet, did not encourage the cherishing of hope. After 40-odd generations, nobody remembered the Icarus anywhere. The wreckage of the lifeboats was long since hidden under the seething, furiously striving fungi of the soil. The human beings had forgotten not only their ancestors' ship, but very nearly everything their ancestors had brought to this world. The use of metals, the existence of fire, and even the fact that there was such a thing as sunshine. They lived in the lowlands, deep under the cloud bank, amidst surroundings which were riotous, swarming, frenzied horror. They had become savages. They were less than savages because they had forgotten their destiny as men. End of prologue. Chapter 1 of The Forgotten Planet by Murray Leinster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mad Planet. In all his lifetime of perhaps 20 years, it had never occurred to Burl to wonder what his grandfather had thought about his surroundings. The grandfather had come to an untimely end in a fashion which Burl remembered as a succession of screams coming more and more faintly to his ears, while he was being carried away at the topmost speed of which his mother was capable. Burl had rarely or never thought of his grandfather since. Surely he had never wondered what his great-grandfather had thought, and most surely of all, he never speculated upon what his many times removed great-grandfather had thought when his lifeboat landed from the Icarus. Burl had never heard of the Icarus. He had done very little thinking of any sort. When he did think, it was mostly agonized effort to contrive a way to escape some immediate and paralyzing danger. When horror did not press upon him, it was better not to think, because there wasn't much but horror to think about. At the moment, he was treading cautiously over a brownish carpet of fungus, creeping furtively toward the stream, which he knew only by the generic name of water. It was the only water he knew, towering far above his head, 3-man heights high. Great toadstools hid the gray sky from his sight. Clinging to the yard-thick stalks of the toadstools were still other fungi, parasites upon the growths that had once been parasites themselves. Burl appeared a fairly representative specimen of the descendants of the long-forgotten Icarus crew. He wore a single garment twisted about his middle, made from the wing fabric of a great moth, which the members of his tribe had slain as it emerged from its cocoon. His skin was fair, without a trace of sunburn. In all his lifetime, he had never seen the sun, though he surely had seen the sky often enough. It was rarely hidden from him, save by giant fungi, like those about him now, and sometimes by the gigantic cabbages, which were nearly the only green growths he knew. To him, normal landscapes contained only fantastic pallid mosses and misshapen fungus growths and colossal molds and yeasts. He moved onward. Despite his caution, his shoulder once touched a cream-colored toadstool stalk, giving the whole fungus a tiny shock. Instantly, a fine and impalpable powder fell upon him from the umbrella-like top above. It was the season when the toadstools sent out their spores. He paused to brush them from his head and shoulders. They were, of course, deadly poison. Burl knew such matters with an immediate and specific and detailed certainty. He knew practically nothing else. He was ignorant of the use of fire, of metals, and even of the uses of stone and wood. His language was a scanty group of a few hundred labial sounds, conveying no abstractions and few concrete ideas. He knew nothing of wood, because there was no wood in the territory furtively inhabited by his tribe. This was the lowlands. Trees did not thrive here. Not even grasses and tree ferns could compete with mushrooms and toadstools and their kin. Here was the soil of rusts and yeasts. Here were toadstool forests and fungus jungles. They grew with feverish intensity beneath a cloud-hidden sky, while above them fluttered butterflies no less enlarged than they, moths as much magnified, and other creatures which could thrive on their corruption. The only creatures on the planet which crawled or ran or flew, save only Burl's fugitive kind, were insects. They had been here before men came, and they had adapted to the planet's extraordinary ways. With a world made ready before their progenitors arrived, insects had thriven incredibly. With unlimited food supplies, they had grown large. With increased size had come increased opportunity for survival, and enlargement became hereditary. Other than fungoid growths, the solitary vegetables were the sports of unstable varieties of the plants left behind by the Lundred. There were enormous cabbages with leaves the size of ship sails, on which stolid grubs and caterpillars ate themselves to maturity, and then swung below in strong cocoons to sleep the sleep of metamorphosis. The tiniest butterflies of earth had increased their size here until their wings spread feet across, and some, like the emperor moths, stretched out purple wings which were yards in span. Burl himself would have been dwarfed beneath a great moth's wing. But he wore a gaudy fabric made of one. The moths and giant butterflies were harmless to men. Burl's fellow tribesmen sometimes came upon a cocoon when it was just about to open, and if they dared, they waited timorously beside it until the creature inside broke through its sleeping shell and came out into the light. Then, before it gathered energy from the air, and before its wings swelled to strength and firmness, the tribesmen fell upon it. They tore the delicate wings from its body and the still flaccid limbs from their places, and when it lay helpless before them, they fled away to feast on its juicy, meat-filled limbs. They dared not linger, of course. They left their prey helpless, staring strangely at the world about it, through its many faceted eyes before the scavengers came to contest its ownership. If nothing more deadly appeared, surely the ants would come. Some of them were only inches long, but others were the size of fox terriers. All of them had to be avoided by men. They would carry moth carcasses away to their underground cities triumphantly in shreds and morsels. But most of the insect world was neither so helpless nor so unthreatening. Burl knew of wasps almost the length of his own body, with stings that were instantly fatal. To every species of wasp, however, some other insect is predestined prey. Wasps need not be dreaded too much, and bees were similarly aloof. They were hard put to it for existence, those bees.
Whoa,
Since
I
few
got
flowers bloomed,
540 more
they were
flowers.
reduced to expedients
I'm gonna go
that
ahead.
once were considered signs of degeneracy in their race. Bubbling yeasts and fouler things, or occasionally the nectarless blooms of the rank giant cabbages. Burl knew the bees. They droned overhead, nearly as large as he was, their bulging eyes gazing at him and everything else in abstracted preoccupation. There were crickets and beetles and spiders. Burl knew spiders. His grandfather had been the prey of a hunting tarantula, which had leaped with incredible ferocity from its tunnel in the ground. A vertical pit, a yard in diameter, went down for 20 feet. At the bottom of the lair, the monster waited for the tiny sounds that would warn him of prey approaching his hiding place. Burl's grandfather had been careless. The terrible shrieks he uttered as he was seized still lingered vaguely in Burl's mind. And he had seen, too, the web of another species of spider, inch-thick cables, with dirty silk, and watched as the misshapen bee sucked the juices from its creature. It stretched. He remembered the stripes of yellow and black and silver that crossed upon its abdomen. He had been fascinated and horrified by the tangled in hopeless coils of the spider began its feast. Burl knew these creatures. They were part of his life. It was this knowledge that made life possible. He knew the ways that made him dead. But if he yielded to carelessness for one moment, or if he relaxed his caution for one instant, he would be one with his ancestors. They were the long-forgotten meal of inhuman monsters. Now, to be sure, Burl moved upon an errand that probably no other of his tribe would have imagined. The day before, he had found a shapeless man, intertangled growth, the duel, huge orange. Their carapaces were waist-high to Burl. Their mandibles, gaping laterally, clicked and clashed upon each other's impenetrable armor. Their legs crashed like so many cymbals as they struck against each other. They fought over some particularly attractive bit of carrion. Burl had watched with wide eyes until a gaping hole appeared in the armor of the smaller one. It uttered a grating outcry, or seemed to. The noise was actually the tearing of its shell between the mandibles of the victor. The wounded creature struggled more and more feebly. When it ceased to offer battle, the conqueror placidly began to dine before its prey had ceased to live. But this was the custom of creatures on this planet. Burl watched, timorous but hopeful. When the meal was finished, he darted in quickly as the diner lumbered away. He was almost too late. Even then, an ant, the forerunner of many, already inspected the fragments with excitedly vibrating antennae. Burl needed to move quickly, and he did. Ants were stupid and short-sighted insects. Few of them were hunters. Save when offered battle, most of them were scavengers only. They hunted the scenes of nightmare for the dead and dying only, but fought viciously if their prey were questioned. And always there were others on the way. Some were arriving now. Hearing the tiny clickings of their approach, Burl was hasty, over hasty. He seized a loosened fragment and fled. It was merely the horn, the snout of the dead and eaten creature, but it was loose and easily carried. He ran. Later he inspected his find with disappointment. There was little meat clinging to it. It was merely the horn of a minotaur beetle, shaped like the horn of a rhinoceros. Plucking out the shreds left by its murderer, he pricked his hand. Pettishly, he flung it aside. The time of darkness was near, so he crept to the hiding place of his tribe to huddle with them until light came again. There were only 20 of them, 4 or 5 men and 6 or 7 women. The rest were girls or children. Burl had been wondering at the strange feelings that came over him when he looked at one of the girls. She was younger than Burl, perhaps 18, and fleeter of foot. They talked together sometimes, and once or twice Burl shared an especially succulent find of foodstuffs with her. He could share nothing with her now. She stared at him in the deepening night when he crept to the labyrinthian hiding place the tribe now used in a mushroom forest. He considered that she looked hungry and hoped that he would have food to share, and he was bitterly ashamed that he could offer nothing. He held himself a little apart from the rest because of this shame. Since he, too, was hungry, it was some time before he slept. Then he dreamed. Next morning he found the horn where he had thrown it disgustedly the day before. It was sticking in the flabby trunk of a toadstool. He pulled it out. In his dream he had used it. Presently he tried to use it. Sometimes, not often, the men of the tribe used the saw-toothed edge of a cricket leg or the leg of a grasshopper to sever tough portions of an edible mushroom. The horn had no cutting edge, but Burl had used it in his dream. He was not quite capable of distinguishing clearly between reality and dreams, so he tried to duplicate what happened in the dream. Remembering that it had stuck into the mushroom stalk, he thrust it. It stabbed. He remembered distinctly how the larger beetle had used its horn as a weapon. It had stabbed, too. He considered absorbedly. He could not imagine himself fighting one of the dangerous insects, of course. Men did not fight on the forgotten planet. They ran away. They hid. But somehow Burl formed a fantastic picture of himself stabbing food with his horn, as he had stabbed a mushroom. It was longer than his arm, and though naturally clumsy in his hand, it would have been a deadly weapon in the grip of a man prepared to do battle. Battle did not occur to Burl, but the idea of stabbing food with it was clear. There could be food that would not fight back. Presently he had an inspiration. His face brightened. He began to make his way toward the tiny river that ran across the plain in which the tribe of humans lived by foraging in competition with the ant. Yellow-bellied newts, big enough to be lusted for, swam in its waters. The swimming larvae of 1,000 kinds of creatures floated on the sluggish surface or crawled over the bottom. There were deadly things there, too. Giant crayfish snapped their claws at the unwary. One of them could sever Burl's arm with ease. Mosquitoes sometimes hummed high above the river. Mosquitoes had a 4-inch wingspread now, though they were dying out for lack of plant juices on which the males of their species fed. But they were formidable. Burl had learned to crush them between fragments of fungus. He crept slowly. What should have been grass underfoot was brownish rust. Orange and red and purple molds clustered about the bases of the creamy mushroom trunks. Once Burl paused to run his weapon through a fleshy column and reassure himself that what he planned was possible. He made his way furtively through the bulbous growths. Once he heard clickings and froze to stillness. 4 or 5 ants, minims only 8 inches long, were returning by a habitual pathway to their city. They moved sturdily along, heavily laden over the route marked by the scent of formic acid left by their fellow townsmen. Burl waited until they had passed, then went on. He came to the bank of the river. It flowed slowly, green scum covering a great deal of its surface in the backwaters, occasionally broken by a slowly enlarging bubble released from decomposing matter on the bottom. In the center of the stream, the current ran a little more swiftly, and the water itself seemed clear. Over it ran many water spiders. They had not shared in the general increase of size in the insect world, depending as they did on the surface tension of the water for support. To have grown larger and heavier would have destroyed them. Burl surveyed the scene. His search was 4 parts for danger and only 1 part for a way to test his brilliant notion, but that was natural. Where he stood, the green scum covered the stream for many yards. Downriver a little, though, the current came closer to the bank. Here he could not see whatever swam or crawled or wriggled under water. There he might. There was an outcropping rock forming a support for crawling stuff, which in turn supported shelf fungi, making wide steps almost down to the water's edge. Burl was making his way cautiously toward them when he saw one of the edible mushrooms, which formed so large a part of his diet. He paused to break off a flabby white piece large enough to feed him for many days. It was the custom of his people, when they found a store of food, to hide with it and not venture out again to danger until it was all eaten. Burl was tempted to do just that with his booty. He could give Saya of this food, and they would eat together. They might hide together until it was all consumed.
Yeah, I don't want to watch this. Do you have a good note in here? Oh, in the book, I don't know. But it's a public domain book, but I don't want it to be a bad scene, a bad scene in there. I'll throw it away. I thought it'd be an ecosystem science fiction book against inspiration for my series, but my series. But I don't have enough firm enough grasp of this time area that I want to write this series in. I have to do a lot more research before I delve into it. So I'm gonna put hold. I want to declare my intent to make it. But I'll put hold now. Which means I don't know how I'm pull it off. But I intend to make it if no one else does. think I'm gonna. I don't want to mislead them. Think I'm writing a Luke series, and I'm not. So I want to write a Luke series. Is the thing about it. I don't know how. I know I can do it. I just don't know how to do it. I'm gonna check this out. Six, 7. I started getting sloppy. I'm trying to feel this whole thing over again. The more you want to bring it together, the more you want to tear it apart. Nope. Perfect. Oops. Edit. One small detail. Yeah, that is a wrap of the first 71 scenes of this movie. I wonder if everyone's confused. Nice. one person looked at.